The beginning of Angela's journey. St. Christopher's Medical Center stood as a prestigious institution in the heart of a bustling city. Known for its excellence in patient care and groundbreaking medical advancements, it was the last place one would expect to find institutionalized prejudice. But hidden beneath its polished facade were deep-rooted biases, buried in silence by time and culture. This was the reality Angela Parker would soon confront, though she had no way of knowing it the morning she first walked through its gleaming doors. Angela Parker, a bright, compassionate nurse, had worked tirelessly to get where she was. She graduated with honors from one of the top nursing schools in the country. Her journey was not an easy one. As a black woman, she was often reminded, both subtly and overtly, that she had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as competent as her white counterparts. But Angela didn't let it break her spirit. Instead, it fueled her determination. The long nights of study, the grueling hours spent honing her skills, the sacrifices she made. Angela had paid the price for her dreams, and now it was time for her to collect. St. Christopher's was her dream job. Located in a well-off neighborhood, it was known for offering cutting-edge treatment to its patients. Angela was excited, though nervous, as she walked up the steps to the hospital on her first day, the crisp autumn air stinging her cheeks. Clutching her bag, she felt the weight of her new responsibilities and the significance of what this opportunity meant for her career. She had finally made it, or so she thought. As soon as Angela entered the hospital, she noticed the sterile, almost too perfect atmosphere. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, and the floors were polished to a shine. Everything looked orderly, almost as if the chaos of sickness and human frailty had no place here. But the underlying tension in the air gave her pause. Was it just first-day jitters, or was something off? "Excuse me, ma'am, are you lost?" a voice called out. Angela turned to see a middle-aged white man in a white coat, his face showing a mix of politeness and skepticism. His badge read, "Dr. Richard Weston, Senior Attending Physician." "No, Dr. Weston. I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse," she responded with a warm smile, extending her hand. The doctor's eyes flicked to her hand, but didn't reach out to shake it. "Ah, yes, the new hire. Well, I hope you know this isn't like the places you may have worked before. We run a tight ship here. We have high standards. Make sure you meet them." Before Angela could respond, Dr. Weston turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her standing with her hand still outstretched. She slowly lowered it, feeling the sharp sting of dismissal. A part of her had hoped for a more welcoming introduction, but she reminded herself that this was a place of professionalism, not camaraderie. Taking a deep breath, she made her way toward the head nurse's office. As she walked, she noticed the furtive glances thrown her way by some of the other staff. A group of nurses clustered around the station fell silent as she passed, only to resume their hushed conversations as soon as she was out of earshot. Angela's gut twisted. She was no stranger to this behavior, but it didn't make it any easier. "Here we go again," she muttered under her breath. The head nurse, Margaret Sloan, was waiting for her. Margaret was a tall, no-nonsense woman with sharp features and an even sharper tone. "Miss Parker, I presume," she said without looking up from her clipboard. "Yes, Mom." "Good. I'm a stickler for punctuality. We don't tolerate mediocrity here, and you'll be expected to pull your weight." Margaret handed Angela a schedule and a binder. "Everything you need to know is in here. Study it, memorize it, and for heaven's sake, don't make any mistakes. We have a reputation to uphold." Angela nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, Mom." The first few hours were a whirlwind of paperwork and procedures. Angela focused on absorbing as much information as she could, but the persistent coldness from her colleagues didn't escape her. Every interaction, every sideways glance, made it clear she was an outsider. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she felt it all the same. She had felt this isolation before, during her nursing training, and throughout her life in predominantly white spaces. She had grown up in a family that reminded her every day that the world wouldn't always welcome her with open arms. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You'll have to work twice as hard, Angela, but don't ever let them see you sweat." That night, Angela went home exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She collapsed on her couch, pulling her phone from her bag to call her mother. "How was your first day, baby?" her mother's warm voice asked on the other end. Angela paused, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell her mother everything. How lonely she felt, how she had already encountered resistance, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. "It was fine, Mama. Just a lot to take in," Angela finally said, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mother's silence on the other end told her that she wasn't fooled. "Angela Marie Parker," her mother began, her tone firm but filled with love. "You've come too far to let anyone or anything shake you. You are strong. You are smart. And most importantly, you belong in that hospital just as much as anyone else." Angela blinked back tears. "I know, Mama. It's hard." "Of course it's hard, baby, but you're not alone. You've got the strength of generations behind you. Every time you walk into that hospital, remember that you're carrying their legacy. And remember what I always told you. Don't let them see you sweat." Angela smiled through her tears. "I won't, Mama. I promise." After hanging up the phone, she sat in silence for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the day pressed down on her, but her mother's words gave her strength. "Tomorrow," she told herself, "tomorrow, I'll show them who I am." Little did she know that tomorrow would bring challenges she never could have anticipated. Among the patients at St. Christopher's was one man whose presence would change everything. For Angela, for the hospital, and for the deeply rooted culture of bias that had gone unchecked for too long. His name was Henry Edwards, and though Angela hadn't met him yet, his arrival would soon set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The Silent Watcher. Angela Parker's second day at St. Christopher's Medical Center began like any other. Early morning rounds, briefings, and an underlying current of tension that only she seemed to notice. The hospital buzzed with its usual mechanical efficiency, but for Angela, the invisible barriers were still as present as the air she breathed. The veiled glances and whispered conversations followed her like shadows, but she kept her head high. Today was a new day, and Angela was determined to prove herself. As she reviewed her patient assignments for the day, she couldn't help but notice an unusual addition to her list. Henry Edwards, a man who had been transferred to the hospital's VIP wing. His file was vague, almost suspiciously so. There was no mention of a specific condition, just that he was recovering from an undisclosed surgery. There was no family contact listed, no details about his background. The only thing that stood out was his name, scrawled in capital letters as if it alone carried some weight. "Henry Edwards. Who are you?" Angela whispered to herself, flipping through the pages in his file. Angela's thoughts were interrupted by the abrupt appearance of Dr. Weston. His voice boomed through the hall, startling her. "Nurse Parker," he called from across the station, his tone brusque and impatient. "Are you familiar with the VIP patient list?" Angela straightened. "Yes, Dr. Weston. Mr. Henry Edwards has been assigned to my rounds today." Dr. Weston gave her a look that was hard to read, something between disdain and curiosity. "Don't mess this up," he said, almost under his breath. "Mr. Edwards is an important man. He expects the best, and I expect you to deliver." Angela nodded, though a flicker of irritation sparked within her. His assumption that she would falter was obvious, and it stung. Without waiting for her reply, Dr. Weston strode off down the hall, leaving Angela with a lingering sense of unease. Why had Mr. Edwards been placed under her care? Why the vagueness in his file? And why did the senior staff seem so unusually concerned about his treatment? Determined to stay focused, Angela gathered her supplies and made her way to the VIP wing. As she walked through the gleaming halls of St. Christopher's, the whispers of colleagues, the cold shoulder of Dr. Weston, and the subtle dismissals of her peers all seemed to fade into the background. She focused instead on the task at hand. She had a patient to care for, a man who needed her attention and skill, no matter who he was. Upon reaching Mr. Edwards' room, Angela hesitated briefly at the door. She knocked gently, and hearing no response, entered the room. To her surprise, the room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn over the large windows. The soft hum of medical equipment filled the air. Lying in the center of the room, in a large hospital bed, was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and though his face bore signs of aging, there was an undeniable strength in his features. His deep-set eyes were closed, but as Angela approached, she could sense that this man was not sleeping. Henry Edwards opened his eyes slowly, his gaze locking onto Angela with an intensity that made her pause. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her with a steady, calculating stare. For a moment, Angela felt as if she were the one under observation, not him. She cleared her throat and forced a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards. I'm Angela Parker, your nurse. How are you feeling today?" Mr. Edwards didn't respond right away. He continued to study her, his expression unreadable. Angela wondered if he was evaluating her the way Dr. Weston and so many others had, looking for any sign of weakness or incompetence. She steadied herself, determined not to let his silence shake her. "I'm here to check your vitals and see how you're recovering. I'll also need to change your dressing. If you prefer, I can come back later when it's more convenient for you," Angela offered, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the unease gnawing at her. Finally, Mr. Edwards spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "No need. Do what you need to do." Angela nodded and set to work. As she carefully monitored his vitals and tended to his bandages, she noticed that Mr. Edwards was watching her the entire time, his gaze never wavering. It was unnerving, but she kept her focus. His vitals were stable, and his surgical site appeared to be healing well. Everything seemed routine, except for the patient himself. After several minutes, Angela finished her tasks and stepped back. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Mr. Edwards?" He continued to watch her in silence for a moment before finally speaking again. "Do you like working here, Nurse Parker?" The question caught her off guard. It was unusual for patients to ask about her personal experience, especially those in the VIP wing. She hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Should she be honest? Should she downplay the hostility she had been feeling? "It's challenging," she admitted after a moment, choosing her words carefully. "But I'm here to do my job, and I'm committed to providing the best care for my patients." Mr. Edwards nodded slowly, his expression still unreadable. "Challenging," he echoed. "Yes, I imagine it would be." There was something in the way he said it, a knowing, almost sympathetic tone that caught Angela off guard. Before she could respond, he added, "You'll need to be strong, Nurse Parker. You'll need to be very strong if you want to survive in a place like this." Angela frowned, unsure of what he meant. "I'm sorry, Mr. Edwards. I don't understand." But he didn't elaborate. Instead, he simply closed his eyes again, as if the conversation was over. Angela waited for a moment, unsure if she should press for more, but eventually she gathered her things and left the room, her mind swirling with questions. As she stepped out into the hallway, Angela ran into Nurse Claire, a colleague she had met briefly the day before. Claire was a tall, blonde woman with an air of superiority that Angela had sensed from their first meeting. She was one of the senior nurses, and though she hadn't been openly hostile, her cool indifference had been unmistakable. "Ah, Nurse Parker," Claire said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "How's Mr. Edwards? I heard he's quite a handful." Angela raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. "He seems fine. Stable." "Stable," Claire repeated, her tone mocking. "Well, don't get too comfortable. VIP patients can be difficult." Angela sensed the subtext in Claire's words but chose to ignore it. I'm just doing my job, Claire. Claire smirked. We'll see how long that lasts. With that, Claire turned and walked away, leaving Angela standing alone in the corridor. The warning in her words was clear. Angela knew that Street Christopher's was a place where alliances were formed and enemies were made, often without a word being spoken. But she wasn't here to play games. She was here to work. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Henry Edwards' cryptic words stayed with her. There was something about him, something unsettling, yet oddly reassuring. It was as if he saw something in her that no one else did, as if he knew the challenges she faced and the battles she was fighting beneath the surface. But how? How could a man she had just met know anything about her struggles? As Angela clocked out that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that Henry Edwards was more than just another patient. His presence at the hospital, the way the senior staff seemed to tiptoe around him, and the strange vagueness of his medical file all pointed to something deeper. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, Angela felt that her path and Mr. Edwards were somehow intertwined. Little did she know, the events of the coming days would force that connection into the light, revealing truths that would shake the very foundations of Street Christopher's and challenge everything Angela thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. The unseen forces. The next few days at Street Christopher's Medical Center felt like a test of endurance for Angela Parker. Every shift presented a new challenge, every interaction with her colleagues carried a subtle sting, and every moment seemed to stretch longer than the last. But through it all, her thoughts kept returning to one person, Henry Edwards. His cryptic words from their last conversation echoed in her mind. You'll need to be strong if you want to survive in a place like this. What did he mean by that? Was it just a warning about the general difficulties of working in a high-stakes hospital, or was it something more specific to her? She had felt an undercurrent of something strange during their brief exchanges, an odd sense that Mr. Edwards was more than just another patient, but she couldn't pinpoint why. And while she was used to patients confiding in her, there was something different about him, something that made her feel as though he was watching her closely, waiting for something to happen. Angela entered the VIP wing early that morning, a slight tension gripping her stomach as she approached Mr. Edwards' room. She knocked lightly on the door and waited. No response. Hesitant but committed to her duties, she entered quietly. The room was dimly lit, as always, and Mr. Edwards was lying in bed, his eyes half closed. For a moment, Angela thought he might be asleep, but then he stirred, slowly opening his eyes to meet hers. "You're early today," he said, his voice rasping, but not unkind. "I like to start my rounds early," Angela replied with a small smile, trying to keep the conversation light. "Helps me stay ahead of the day." Mr. Edwards gave a slight nod. Staying ahead, yes, that's important. There it was again, that odd tone, like he was talking about more than just hospital work. Angela was about to respond when a sharp knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. The door swung open, revealing Dr. Weston, his face set in its usual expression of impatience. He glanced at Angela, then at Mr. Edwards. "Nurse Parker, a word outside, please," Dr. Weston said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Angela followed him out into the hallway, her heart racing. Had she done something wrong? Dr. Weston turned to her, his face unreadable. "I've been reviewing your performance over the past week," he began, his voice low but firm. "And while there haven't been any formal complaints, I've noticed that some of your colleagues are having a difficult time adjusting to your presence here." Angela's breath caught in her throat. Adjusting to my presence. She knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't about her performance or her skills. It was about her. Her identity. Her race. The unspoken barrier that had followed her since she first stepped foot in this hospital. But before she could respond, Dr. Weston continued. "I'm sure you understand," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Street Christopher's is a prestigious institution. We have a certain reputation to uphold, and I would hate for there to be any tension or misunderstandings. Angela's hands clenched at her sides, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She knew what was happening here. Dr. Weston wasn't concerned about her abilities. He was concerned about the optics. He was concerned that her presence disrupted the careful, sterile image the hospital liked to project. An image that clearly didn't include people like her. "I understand perfectly, Dr. Weston," Angela said, keeping her voice steady. "But I'm here to do my job, just like everyone else." Dr. Weston raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Of course," he said smoothly, "just be mindful of how you interact with your colleagues. We wouldn't want any unnecessary friction." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Angela standing in the hallway, her mind racing. Unnecessary friction. She had done everything right, worked twice as hard as some of the other nurses, and still it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Shaking off the frustration that had settled in her chest, Angela returned to Mr. Edwards' room, her steps heavier than before. As she entered, she saw him sitting up in bed, his eyes watching her carefully. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence hanging thick between them. "You look troubled," Mr. Edwards finally said, breaking the quiet. Angela hesitated, unsure of how much she should reveal. She didn't want to burden her patient with her own frustrations, but at the same time, there was something about Mr. Edwards that made her feel like he would understand. "It's nothing," she said with a forced smile. "Just the usual workplace challenges." Mr. Edwards' eyes narrowed slightly. The usual challenges, or the kind of challenges that come when you don't fit into the mold they expect. Angela's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? How could he possibly know what she was going through? She hadn't spoken to anyone about the subtle racism, the condescending comments, the looks that made her feel like she didn't belong. "I'm sorry, I don't," she began, but Mr. Edwards cut her off. "I know more than you think, Nurse Parker," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of something deeper, something personal. "I've seen it before. People like you and me. We don't always get treated the way we deserve." Angela blinked, taken aback. "People like you and me." She looked at Mr. Edwards, really looked at him for the first time. His skin was pale, his features worn with age, but there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a shared understanding. Angela wanted to ask more, to press him for details, but before she could say anything, the door swung open again, and Nurse Claire entered the room, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Oh, Nurse Parker," she said, her voice laced with false sweetness. "I didn't realize you were still in here. Don't you have other patients to tend to?" Angela bristled at the insinuation, but before she could respond, Mr. Edwards spoke up. "She's doing just fine," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I prefer Nurse Parker's care. I'm sure the other patients can wait." Claire's face tightened, but she quickly forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. Whatever you prefer." As Claire left the room, Angela couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. It was subtle, but it was there. A moment where she wasn't invisible, where her work and presence were recognized, even if only by one patient. But as the door closed behind Claire, Mr. Edwards turned back to Angela, his expression more serious than before. "You need to be careful, Nurse Parker," he said, his voice low. "There are forces at play here that you don't understand. Forces that will try to push you out if you don't stand your ground." Angela frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Mr. Edwards sighed, leaning back against his pillow. "Let's just say that Street Christopher's isn't as pristine as it looks. There are people here who will do whatever it takes to maintain their version of order. And you're a disruption." Angela's heart raced as his words sunk in. The disruption. That's how they saw her. Not just a nurse trying to do her job, but a problem, a threat to the carefully constructed facade of the hospital. But why? Why was she such a threat? "I don't understand," she said softly. "What does this have to do with me?" Mr. Edwards smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. You'll find out soon enough. The rest of the day passed in a haze for Angela. Mr. Edwards' warning echoed in her mind, mingling with the frustration and anger that had been building inside her for days. She couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening at Street Christopher's, something beyond the surface-level racism and prejudice she had experienced. There were forces at play, as Mr. Edwards had said, and they were moving in ways she couldn't yet see. As Angela clocked out that evening and made her way to the bus stop, she felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, confusion, determination. She knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Whatever was happening at Street Christopher's, whatever these unseen forces were, Angela was ready to face them head-on. But little did she know, the real battle had only just begun. The forces she was up against were far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined, and the truth about Mr. Edwards and his mysterious connection to the hospital would soon come to light in a way that would change everything. The unveiling of secrets. Days blurred into weeks, and the tension at Street Christopher's Medical Center only grew thicker, like an invisible fog settling over everything. Angela Parker continued her work with unwavering professionalism, but there was no denying that the hostile environment was starting to take its toll. The whispers, the exclusion, and the condescending remarks were ever present, eroding her sense of belonging in a place she had once viewed as an opportunity to grow and serve. Still, something within her wouldn't break. Not yet. Not with her mother's words of strength echoing in her mind. And certainly not after the strange, cryptic warnings from Henry Edwards. Angela had become increasingly curious about her patient, this mysterious man who seemed to know more about the undercurrents of the hospital than anyone else. His words had haunted her since their last conversation, about unseen forces and the threat she posed simply by existing in this place. But what did it all mean? And how could he, a patient confined to his bed, have insight into the hidden workings of Street Christopher's? One late evening, after her shift had officially ended, Angela decided she needed answers. It wasn't just about her anymore. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening, something darker that lurked beneath the polished image of the hospital. The way Mr. Edwards had spoken, so calmly, yet with such weight, made her feel like she was standing on the edge of an abyss, with no idea what lay beneath. Angela returned to Mr. Edwards' room that night, long after the other nurses had gone home. The hospital was quieter than usual, the long corridors bathed in an eerie fluorescent light. As she approached his room, her footsteps echoed unnaturally in the empty hallway, heightening her sense of unease. She knocked softly before entering. Mr. Edwards was awake, sitting up in his bed, the dim light casting shadows across his face. "You came back," he said, his voice as calm as ever, though there was a trace of something in his eyes, something like approval. "I wondered if you would." Angela closed the door behind her and took a deep breath. There was no time for pleasantries now. She needed the truth. "I need to know what you meant, Mr. Edwards," she said, stepping closer to his bed. "About the forces at play here. About me being a disruption. What's really going on at Street Christopher's?" Mr. Edwards studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're not like the others, Nurse Parker," he said slowly. "You don't just see what's on the surface. You feel what's underneath. The tension, the prejudice, the way they treat you. It's all part of a larger system. But that's not the worst of it." Angela's pulse quickened. She could feel it, too, that there was more, that this went deeper than just the casual racism and bias she faced daily. But she hadn't expected Mr. Edwards to confirm it so openly. "What do you mean, a system?" she pressed. "Are you talking about the way the hospital is run?" Mr. Edwards let out a slow breath, leaning back against his pillows. "The way the hospital is run is just a symptom. The real problem goes much deeper. There are people in power here, people you don't see, people whose names aren't on the building or on the staff list, who pull the strings. And they don't want change. They want control, absolute control. And when someone threatens that control, Even if it's just by existing, they push back. Angela's skin prickled with unease. She had expected some level of institutional resistance to diversity and progress, but this sounded far more sinister than she could have imagined. "Who are these people?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "And how do you know about them?" Mr. Edwards looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening as though he were debating whether or not to tell her. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less intense. "I wasn't always confined to a bed," he said, his eyes distant as though recalling a painful memory. "Once upon a time, I was part of the system. I was a surgeon here, a successful one. For years, I played by their rules. I ignored the things that didn't sit right with me. I turned a blind eye to the way they treated people who didn't fit the mold. I was complicit because it was easier. And for a while, that worked." Angela's breath caught in her throat. Henry Edwards, a surgeon. She had never known. It wasn't uncommon for doctors to become patients later in life, but the way he spoke, it was clear there was much more to the story. "But then," he continued, his voice hardening, "I started to see things I couldn't ignore anymore. I saw how they manipulated patient outcomes, how they favored the wealthy, how they hid their mistakes and sacrificed people's lives for the sake of their image. And when I tried to expose it, they silenced me." Angela's heart was pounding now. "Silenced you how?" Mr. Edwards smiled, but it was a bitter, cold smile. "Let's just say that the same people who elevated me to the position of power I held were very efficient at taking it all away. My career, my reputation, my health, everything. They buried me." Angela stood frozen, processing his words. This wasn't just about her race or the prejudice she faced. This was about corruption, deep, institutional corruption that went all the way to the top, and Mr. Edwards had been a victim of it. "They'll do the same to you," he said softly, his gaze locking onto hers. "They already are. They see you as a threat because you don't fit into their perfect little world. You disrupt their illusion of control. And if you keep pushing, they'll find a way to push you out. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually they will. That's why you have to be careful." "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked finally. "Why me?" Mr. Edwards smiled again, but this time there was a glimmer of warmth in his eyes. "Because I see the same fire in you that I once had. And because, despite everything they've done to me, I still believe that change is possible. But it won't happen unless people like you, people who care, who are strong enough to stand up, are willing to fight." Angela stood there, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She felt a strange mixture of fear and determination swirling inside her. This wasn't the fight she had expected, but it was the fight she had been called to. And now, more than ever, she knew she couldn't back down. As she left Mr. Edwards' room that night, her mind was awash with plans. She didn't know exactly how she would proceed, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let the system win. She would fight, just like her mother had always told her. She would gather her strength, her allies, and she would expose the truth, no matter the cost. But as Angela walked down the quiet corridors of the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, and for the first time, she realized that the battle she was about to fight wasn't just for her own survival, it was for the soul of Street Christopher's itself. Unmasking the shadows. The days after Angela's conversation with Henry Edwards felt like an eternity. She had always known that working in a predominantly white hospital as a black nurse would come with its challenges, but this was beyond anything she could have ever anticipated. The knowledge that there were invisible forces working against her, against anyone who didn't conform to their narrow view of power, made every step feel heavier. And yet, her resolve had never been stronger. Her mind was constantly racing, replaying Mr. Edwards' words about corruption and hidden agendas. Every sideways glance, every hushed conversation between doctors and administrators, every decision that seemed too convenient, too beneficial for the wealthy patients, took on new meaning. Angela had to be careful, but she also had to act. She knew that whatever was happening at Street Christopher's medical center, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger, so much bigger. A new ally. A week after that fateful conversation with Mr. Edwards, Angela found herself assigned to a new wing of the hospital, Ward 6, an area typically reserved for long-term patients and those who required extended care. It was quieter here, less bustling than the main floors, but the change in atmosphere was palpable. She didn't know if the transfer was a punishment for standing her ground with Dr. Greaves, or if it was part of a larger plan to isolate her. Either way, it felt like a chess move, and Angela knew she had to play her pieces carefully. As she made her rounds, Angela noticed a distinct lack of camaraderie among the staff in Ward 6. The nurses seemed more distant, more guarded. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Angela couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a place where secrets lived in every corner. It wasn't until her second day in the ward that she met Dr. Lydia Santos, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a reputation for being fiercely independent. Dr. Santos was the head of the ward, and unlike many of the other doctors Angela had encountered, she didn't carry the same air of arrogance or superiority. There was something different about her, something that made Angela feel both cautious and curious. "I've heard about you," Dr. Santos said one afternoon, her voice steady as she approached Angela in the break room. There was no malice in her tone, just observation. "You're the one who stood up to Greaves." Angela froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. She had learned early on that trust was a dangerous commodity at Street Christopher's, and she wasn't sure if Dr. Santos was friend or foe. "I didn't stand up to anyone," Angela said cautiously. "I just do my job." Dr. Santos raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. She pulled up a chair and sat down across from Angela, her gaze intense but not hostile. "Listen, Nurse Parker," she began, her tone softening slightly. "I know what it's like to be in your shoes. This hospital, it's not what it seems. I've been here long enough to see how things work, and I've learned to keep my head down. But I'm not blind to what's going on. And I'm not the only one." Angela's pulse quickened. Could this be the ally she needed? Someone else who saw the corruption and was willing to fight it. "You know about the system?" Angela asked, her voice barely above a whisper, not wanting anyone else to overhear. Dr. Santos smiled, but it was a sad, bitter smile. "I've known for a long time. I've seen doctors like Greaves rise through the ranks, not because of their skill, but because they play the game. They protect the ones in power, and in return, they're rewarded. But if you challenge that system, if you try to bring it down, they'll bury you, just like they buried Henry Edwards." Angela's eyes widened. "You know about him?" Dr. Santos nodded slowly. "Henry was one of the best surgeons I've ever worked with. But he made the mistake of believing he could change things from the inside. He tried to expose what was happening. The malpractice, the cover-ups, the way the wealthy patients were given preferential treatment while the poor were neglected. But they turned on him. They destroyed his career, his reputation, and eventually, his health." Angela felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. It was all true, everything Mr. Edwards had said. This wasn't just about her being targeted because of her race. This was a system designed to protect the powerful and punish anyone who threatened that power. "Why are you telling me this?" Angela asked, her voice shaky but determined. "Why now?" Dr. Santos leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto Angela's. "Because you're different. You remind me of Henry when he first started here, full of fire, unwilling to back down. And I can see that they're trying to break you, just like they broke him. But there's still a chance for you. You haven't crossed the point of no return yet. You can still get out." Angela shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I'm not leaving, Dr. Santos. I'm not running away. If there's something wrong here, I want to help fix it." Dr. Santos studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't be enough. If you're serious about this, you'll need allies." And you'll need proof. Proof, Angela repeated, confused. Dr. Santos nodded. Yes, they can deny rumors. They can smear your reputation. But they can't argue with hard evidence. If you want to take them down, you need to find something, records, documents, anything, that shows what they've been doing. Without that, you'll be dismissed as just another troublemaker. Angela felt a flicker of hope. This was the key. If she could gather enough evidence, she could expose the corruption at Street Christopher's and force change. Where do I start? Angela asked, her voice full of determination. Dr. Santos hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. Henry wasn't a fool, she said quietly. He knew they were coming for him, so he started compiling evidence, emails, patient records, internal memos. He gave me this before they silenced him. I didn't know what to do with it. I was too afraid to act. But maybe you can do something with it. Angela took the USB drive, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the key to everything. If what Dr. Santos said was true, this drive could hold the proof she needed to expose the corruption at the hospital. I'll help you, Dr. Santos added, her voice low. But we have to be careful. If they suspect anything, they'll come for both of us. Angela nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. This was dangerous, far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. But she knew in her heart that she couldn't turn back now. Too many lives had been affected. Too many people had been silenced. I'm in, Angela said firmly, clutching the USB drive in her hand. Let's bring them down. The investigation begins. That night, Angela couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what she had agreed to pressing down on her. She knew she was risking everything, her job, her reputation, even her safety. But there was no other option. Not anymore. The next day, Angela began her investigation in earnest. She spent her breaks in the hospital library, poring over medical records and patient files, looking for any inconsistencies or unusual patterns. She scanned through billing records, noticing how certain patients, those with deep pockets, seemed to receive preferential treatment, while others were mysteriously discharged or had their cases lost in the system. But the real breakthrough came one afternoon when Angela managed to access a restricted section of the hospital's database using the login credentials Dr. Santos had given her. There she found the smoking gun, a series of emails between Dr. Greaves and the hospital administration, discussing ways to mitigate risks and maximize revenue by pushing out lower-income patients and focusing on wealthy donors. Angela's heart raced as she printed out the emails, her hands shaking slightly. This was it, solid proof of corruption at the highest levels of the hospital. But as she gathered the papers, Angela felt a chill run down her spine. Someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw a figure in the distance, a man in a dark suit, standing near the entrance to the library, his eyes fixed on her. Angela quickly stuffed the papers into her bag and walked out of the library, her heart pounding. She didn't know who the man was, but she knew one thing for certain. The people in power were watching her, and they weren't going to let her expose them without a fight. The reckoning. Angela's hands were trembling as she made her way out of the hospital library, the stack of incriminating documents hidden in her bag. The figure in the dark suit hadn't moved, but his gaze followed her, intense and unyielding. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together the next steps in this dangerous game of cat and mouse. She couldn't let fear paralyze her now. She had come too far. She had evidence, and with it, the power to expose the corruption that had poisoned Street Christopher's medical center for years. But she also had enemies, powerful ones who would stop at nothing to silence her. Angela stepped into the elevator, her pulse pounding in her ears. The quiet hum of the hospital floor felt distant, drowned out by the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in her head. As the doors slid shut, she realized there was no turning back. The reckoning was coming, and she had to be prepared. A dangerous discovery. Angela knew she couldn't act alone anymore. The evidence she had gathered was enough to ignite a firestorm, but she needed allies, people she could trust to help her navigate the treacherous waters ahead. She couldn't afford to make a misstep. With the USB drive Dr. Santos had given her, and the stack of printed emails now in her possession, Angela knew she had the tools to take down Dr. Greaves and the corrupt administration. But this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about systemic exploitation and the misuse of power that had gone unchecked for far too long. The first person she thought of was Henry Edwards. She needed to talk to him again, but not as a nurse speaking to a patient. This time, they were allies in the same fight. She had to trust him, despite the layers of mystery surrounding his past. Whatever power he wielded before, it was clear that it hadn't disappeared entirely. But Henry had been moved to a different room after his condition had suddenly worsened, and Angela wasn't sure how much time she had left to get his help. If the administration was deliberately keeping him out of the picture, she needed to act fast. She made her way to the new ward where Henry had been transferred. The tension in the air was palpable as she approached his room. A strange quiet filled the corridor, unusual for a hospital. She knocked lightly on the door, and after a few seconds, Henry's voice called from inside. "Come in." Angela entered cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. Henry was sitting up in his bed, looking more alert than he had the last time she'd seen him. His dark eyes met hers with a knowing look. "You found something, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Angela nodded and closed the door behind her. "I did, but it's worse than I thought." Henry sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I knew it. They'd been trying to keep you away from me. That transfer wasn't because of my health, Angela. It's because they're afraid of what I know, and what you're starting to find out." Angela pulled the stack of documents from her bag and handed them to Henry. Emails, proof that Dr. Greaves and the administration have been manipulating patient outcomes to prioritize wealthy donors. They've been discharging vulnerable patients, covering up malpractice, and funneling resources to those who can afford it. Henry scanned the papers, his face darkening with every word. "This is enough to blow the lid off this whole operation," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "But it's not going to be easy. They'll come after you. Hard." "I know," Angela said, her voice resolute. "But I can't stay silent anymore. Too many people are suffering because of this, and if I don't act, no one will." Henry looked up at her, admiration and concern flickering in his eyes. "You're braver than most people I've known, but you're going to need more than bravery to take them down. You'll need protection." "What kind of protection?" Angela asked, her brow furrowing. Henry hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward. "Before all this, before they ruined me, I had connections. People who owe me favors. If we can get this evidence to the right hands, people who can't be bought or threatened, we might stand a chance. But we need to move fast." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this, an underground network of contacts who could help. But she realized it made sense. Henry Edwards had been a top surgeon, well connected in the medical world, and now she understood that his influence stretched far beyond the walls of Street Christopher's. "How do we do this?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency. Henry reached for his phone, which had been placed on the small table beside his bed. "I'll make a call. But in the meantime, you need to be careful. They're watching you." Angela's thoughts flashed back to the man in the dark suit. "I know. I already felt it." Henry's fingers moved quickly across the screen as he typed a message. "I'll set up a meeting for tonight. But you need to be prepared for what comes next. Once this starts, there's no turning back." Angela nodded, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy cloak. "I'm ready." The shadowy allies. Later that evening, Angela found herself walking through an unfamiliar part of town, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Henry's contact had set the meeting for a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, far from prying eyes. It felt surreal, almost like something out of a thriller movie, but Angela's reality had become just that, a dangerous game where every move was fraught with risk. She approached the entrance to the warehouse and knocked twice, as instructed. The door creaked open, and a tall man with a serious expression ushered her inside. The room was dimly lit, and Angela's heart raced as she noticed a few other figures gathered around a large table in the center. Henry was already there, sitting quietly with his hands folded in front of him. "Angela, meet the people who are going to help us," Henry said, gesturing toward the group. The figures were a mix of men and women, all of them dressed in plain clothes, but their demeanor suggested that they were anything but ordinary civilians. These were people who had seen the worst of the system and knew how to fight back. One of the women, a tall, slender figure with piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Lena, former investigative journalist. I've been tracking corruption in the medical field for years, and when Henry reached out, I knew this was big." Angela shook her hand, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in this anymore. There were others who saw the injustice and were willing to help. Over the next hour, the group discussed their plan in detail. Lena had connections in the media, people who could bring the story to light without fear of retribution. Another man, Marcus, was a cybersecurity expert who promised to keep their communications secure and help track down any additional evidence buried in the hospital systems. But the most important piece of the puzzle was timing. They needed to release the evidence at just the right moment, when the hospital's board of directors was convening for their annual review. If they could expose the corruption then, in front of the entire board, it would be impossible for Dr. Greaves and his cronies to cover it up. "We have one shot at this," Lena said, her voice firm. "If we miss, they'll come after all of us. Hard." Angela swallowed, the enormity of what they were about to do hitting her full force. But she nodded, resolute. "I understand. Let's make it count." The final hour. The day of the board meeting arrived quickly. Angela had hardly slept, her nerves on edge as she prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most important day of her life. The documents were ready, the media contacts had been alerted, and Marcus had managed to hack into the hospital's secure server to retrieve even more damning evidence. Internal memos that showed how patient records had been falsified and malpractice swept under the rug. As she walked into the hospital that morning, Angela could feel the tension in the air. Dr. Greaves was strutting through the halls, his usual arrogance on full display, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety in his movements. He knew something was off. Angela's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to the boardroom, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. Henry was already there, seated quietly in the back, his presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. The meeting began as usual, with the board members discussing the hospital's finances and future plans. Dr. Greaves gave his usual polished speech, talking about the hospital's commitment to excellence and patient care. But Angela knew that behind those empty words was a system built on greed and exploitation. When it was finally her turn to speak, Angela stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She took a deep breath and walked to the front of the room, her eyes locking onto Dr. Greaves as she inserted the USB drive into the computer. "What you're about to see," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "is the truth about Street Christophers. The truth that's been hidden for too long." As the documents and emails appeared on the screen, the room fell silent. The board members stared in shock as the evidence of corruption, malpractice, and greed was laid bare before them. Dr. Greaves' face turned ashen, his smug expression replaced by one of pure panic. "This is a lie," he shouted, but his words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Angela stood tall, her voice calm and unwavering. "This is the truth, and it's time for Street Christophers to answer for it." The aftermath. For a moment, The room seemed frozen in time. The board members sat in stunned silence as they stared at the screen, unable to process the enormity of what Angela had just revealed. The damning emails and internal memos exposed a network of lies that ran deeper than any of them could have imagined. Corruption was not just a blight on the administration. It was deeply embedded in the hospital's culture. Angela could feel the weight of their stares, the disbelief mixed with something else. Fear. The powerful men and women who sat at this table were used to controlling narratives, used to sweeping problems under the rug with donations and PR spin. But now, the truth was out. There was no hiding it anymore. Dr. Greaves' outburst echoed in the silence. This is outrageous. These documents are fabricated. This woman has no credibility. She's been working here for less than a year, and now she claims to know more about how we run this hospital than the people who built it. His voice cracked with desperation, but Angela wasn't swayed. She had anticipated this, had expected him to deny everything. She met his gaze, her eyes hard and unyielding. "The truth doesn't care how long I've worked here, Dr. Greaves," Angela replied, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. "The truth speaks for itself." One of the board members, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, finally broke the silence. Her voice was low but carried a weight of authority. "How do you explain these emails, Dr. Greaves? They were sent from your office. Are you claiming that someone planted these in your system?" Greaves opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His face flushed with anger and frustration. He turned toward Angela, his expression venomous. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. "You think you can come into my hospital and destroy everything we've built. You think you're some kind of hero." Angela's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refuses to let people like you get away with exploiting the vulnerable." Before Dr. Greaves could respond, the door to the boardroom opened, and two men in dark suits walked in. Angela recognized them immediately. Henry's contacts from his former life, part of the network of influence he had cultivated before everything had gone wrong. The men approached the board's chairwoman and handed her a folder. She opened it and began reading, her face growing increasingly stern as she flipped through the pages. Angela could only guess what was in that folder. More evidence, perhaps, or legal documentation ready to trigger an investigation. The chairwoman closed the folder and looked up at Dr. Greaves. "We will be conducting a full investigation, effective immediately. Dr. Greaves, until further notice, you are suspended from your position as Chief Medical Officer." Greaves' face twisted in fury. "You can't do this. This hospital wouldn't exist without me." The chairwoman didn't flinch. "Your actions have put this institution at risk. We can, and we will do this." Security personnel had already appeared in the doorway, ready to escort Dr. Greaves out of the room. Angela could hardly believe what was happening, the rapid unraveling of his power. She had known the truth would come out, but she hadn't expected it to happen this quickly, this definitively. As Greaves was led out, still sputtering threats, Angela felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she knew this was only the beginning. The board's investigation was a first step, but there were still more people involved, more layers to uncover. Confrontation with shadows. Later that evening, Angela met with Henry and Lena at a small cafe, away from the hospital's watchful eyes. Lena had been quiet throughout the meeting, but now she finally spoke, her voice tinged with concern. "You did great in there, Angela, but you have to know that this isn't over. Grades might be out, but there are still others in the administration who will fight to protect themselves. They'll be watching you more closely now." Angela nodded, feeling the weight of Lena's words. "I know, but I'm ready for it." Henry, who had been unusually silent, leaned forward, his expression serious. "We've rattled the cage, Angela. The people in power won't go down without a fight. Graves is just the frontman. They'll try to regroup, cover their tracks, and push back." Angela looked at him, her mind racing. "Then we keep pushing. We've started something, and I don't intend to stop until we've cleaned house." Henry smiled faintly, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "I knew you were tough, but this is something else. You've got guts." Angela's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the tense moment. She glanced down to see an unfamiliar number. Hesitating for a moment, she answered. "Hello." A voice crackled on the other end, low and cautious. "Is this Angela Carson?" "Yes." "Who's calling?" The voice hesitated, then continued. "You don't know me, but I know what you've been doing. And I think you should know, you're not the only one looking into Dr. Greaves. There are others, but be careful. Some of them aren't on your side." Angela's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" "That doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you've stirred up something much bigger than you realize. Be ready." The line went dead before Angela could ask any more questions. She lowered the phone, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? Who else was involved? And what were their motives? Lena noticed the look on her face. "What's wrong?" Angela shook her head, still processing. "Someone just called. They said I'm not the only one looking into this, and that I need to be careful." Henry frowned. "Could be a warning. Or a threat." Angela nodded, her grip tightening around her phone. "Either way, it means we're on the right track. But now, I have to figure out who's pulling the strings behind all this, and what they're really after." New players in the game. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and tension. The board's investigation had begun in earnest, but Angela knew that the people behind the corruption wouldn't go down without a fight. As she continued to dig deeper into the hospital's records, with Marcus helping her navigate the labyrinth of digital files, she began to see patterns. Connections between donors, board members, and shadowy organizations that seemed to have their fingers in more than just healthcare. One name kept coming up, one that Angela had never heard before: the Orpheus Group. It was mentioned in several of the documents Marcus had uncovered, always in passing, but with enough frequency that it seemed important. "What's the Orpheus Group?" Angela asked Marcus one afternoon as they sat in a secure location, reviewing files on his laptop. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face troubled. "That's what we're trying to figure out. It's not just a medical group. It looks like they have ties to finance, government, even defense. And the fact that their name keeps popping up here. It's not good." Angela's stomach churned. This was bigger than she had imagined. Far bigger. The corruption at Street Christopher's wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger network, one that reached into the highest levels of power. "We need more evidence," Angela said, her voice steely. "We need to find out who's behind the Orpheus Group and what they want." Marcus nodded. "I'm on it. But be careful, Angela. These people play a different game. They don't just bury scandals. They bury people." Angela's resolve hardened. She had uncovered the truth about Dr. Greaves, but now it was clear that he was just a pawn. The real players were still out there, hidden in the shadows, and they wouldn't hesitate to protect their interests. But Angela wasn't backing down. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now, not when the stakes were this high.